Welcome everyone to our event, Racism and Resistance, a roundtable on Asian American experience in the pandemic. We're here today because the pandemic has been very challenging. We have an opportunity to discuss the long history of anti-Asian racism in the US, political economic challenges today because of COVID-19, and ideas for action and response here in the Asian Pacific Islander community. I want to begin by giving everyone an overview of the schedule for this evening. We're going to begin with panelist presentations. This will be followed by a moderated question and answer by myself. From there, we will move to question and answer from the audience. We will then move into small breakout groups for discussion, and then coming back together at the end for concluding remarks. As we begin here, I'd like to do a few introductions to people. First, I would like to introduce both Clara Liu and Kevin Xu, members of the Stanford Asian Pacific America Alumni Club, who are co-sponsoring this event and who will be our open moderators for the question and answer from the audience. Our co-sponsors for this event are the Asian American Activities Center, the Asian American Students Association, the Asian American Studies at Stanford, Okada House, and as I mentioned, SAPAC, Stanford Asian Pacific American Alumni Club. Even though we are separated by physical distances and time zones, you can still be engaged with these organizations and their activities. Students can attend Asian American Activities Center programs digitally or join ASA. Graduating students and alumni can join SAPAC. So I hope everyone following this event continues to stay connected to the Stanford community. I want to begin by introducing our panelists for this evening. So to begin with here, we have Dr. Russell Jeung. He received his bachelor's degree in human biology and a master's degree in education from Stanford University. After working in China in the mayor's office of San Francisco, he obtained his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley in 2000. After teaching at Foothill College for 2 years, he came to San Francisco State's University of Asian American Studies program in 2002. Our next panelist is Linda Li. Linda is the Associate Director at Chinese Progressive Association in San Francisco. A child of Hmong refugee family, Linda has a long history of Asian American movement building work. Linda got introduced to CPA when she was an undergrad learning the ropes of student organizing in the early 2000s. She joined the staff of CPA in 2011 as the Development and Communications Associate and has embodied many different roles since then. Linda has a bachelor's degree in Asian American Studies from Stanford. Next is Dr. Judy Wu. Professor Wu is a professor of Asian American Studies at UC Irvine and the director of the Humanities Center. She received her bachelor's degree in American Studies from Stanford and her PhD in history, also from Stanford. And finally, my name is Will Gao. I'm a lecturer here at Stanford. I hold a PhD in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley, and I teach classes here at Stanford, including Introduction to Asian American History, Introduction to Asian American Studies, and Asian American Film and Popular Culture. So having done our introductions here, I will now transition to letting each of our panelists speak for approximately 10 minutes. Dr. Judy Wu.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me and also see my PowerPoint? Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation to engage with all of you tonight. May is a month that I tend to associate with Stanford. That's the month that I participated in 1989 in the takeover of the president's office that helped to establish Asian American Studies. And then just when Will was reading off the organizations and the offices that are at Stanford, it made me feel like I was coming home. ASA, AQC, Okada, these were all places that I had a connection to when I was a student. I also wanted to thank you for this because it's actually my first time talking about the pandemic. I've been busy organizing events to think about the impact of the pandemic on the AAPI communities, but it's actually my first time sharing my own thoughts about what we're experiencing. And I'm coming to you tonight with a lot of anger and also a lot of sorrow. Every day there are people dying from the disease. And my own father passed away recently It was not COVID-19 related. He actually passed away the same day that Donald Kennedy did, who was a former president. He was president at Stanford when I was engaged in the protest in 1989. But the shelter-in-place orders, which are so important for keeping us, or trying to keep us safe, prevented my mother and I from visiting him in the nursing home. And thankfully, she was able to see him before he passed away. And that experience was so important for her to have a sense of comfort. But I know many other people aren't able to see their loved ones, and they're experiencing death and anxiety and a lot of suffering. So I want to begin with that to explain that I am empathetic and sympathetic to what people are experiencing. I'm also very angry because certain political leaders are using the pandemic to either target particular communities as the enemy or to neglect communities that are suffering from higher rates of infection and death, most notably African Americans, Latinx, Native Americans, and Pacific Islanders. These social divisions existed before the pandemic, but the pandemic is making it even more clear who are the people who have resources, right? People who can work from afar, people who live in less crowded neighborhoods, people who have access to public health and safety information, access to testing, to healthcare, versus those who have not. So I'd like to share today how the blame that President Trump tends to heap on everyone but himself has focused on China. I think many of you probably have already seen this graphic, but this comes from a briefing booklet that President Trump had. And as you can tell, he crossed out Corona and wrote Chinese to remind everyone the source of the contagion of the COVID-19. And his disrespect and contempt extends to people of Chinese ancestry in the United States. This just gives you an overview of the exchange that happened just yesterday at a White House newspaper briefing, in which Trump told Wei Jiajing, who's a CBS reporter, to ask China her questions about the coronavirus. And this is not just a personalized attack that he makes, but it's actually, and also I just want to mention that she's the person who reported they use the phrase Kung flu to describe the coronavirus. But this is actually a political strategy that the Republican Party has engaged in. This is a memo that the Senate Republicans had released, or actually they didn't release it, it was a secret memo, it was a strategy memo. It was an aftermath of Trump talking about using bleach and disinfectant and possibly injecting those products as a way to prevent the spread of COVID-19, protect you from COVID-19. And their response was, well, don't defend Trump on that, but let's continue the attack on China. That's where we need to focus our political energies. So at least a line was drawn by the Republicans, but China was on the other side. People of Chinese ancestry were on the other side of what was acceptable and what was unacceptable. So I'd like to talk today briefly, and I've asked Will to stop me in case I go long, about the deep roots of this anti-Chinese sentiment. I think many of us know that the Chinese were the first group in the country to be banned from immigration based on nationality and class. Chinese laborers were excluded through the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And for much of the late 19th century through the first half of the 20th century, they were considered aliens and eligible for citizenship. And I just wanted to pause on that. And I think many of us are familiar with that. But to think that the construction of what it means to be American, the construction of what it means to be a citizen, is fundamentally antagonistic to what it means to be Chinese. The concept of Orientalism, that there's a long-standing Western tradition of viewing Asia as the other, as the antithesis of Western society, and that you might think about the Chinese Exclusion Act as a political form of that Orientalism, that it's not cultural practice, it's not social practice, but it's legalized into our state. And that process of designating certain people as forever foreign, as antagonistic to what it means to be American, is motivated by economic motivations. It's motivated by racial antagonism. And both those aspects, the economic and the racial, are also colored or communicated through fears about food and fears about contagion. So if you remember when the virus was starting to become a global source of news, a lot of the news reports, and still now, are going back to this idea of China, Wuhan, the seafood market there as a source of contagion. And these are just some examples of how that is not just an existing strategy in the 21st century, but is a long-standing practice. This is the primary source that actually Professor Guang Chang at Stanford introduced me to when I was an undergraduate. And I think it's so powerful. This is an anti-immigration tract that was published by the American Federation of Labor. And it was used to both justify the continuation of Chinese exclusion, but to also extend it to Japanese exclusion. And you just look at the title or the subtitle, right? Meat versus rice, American manhood versus Asiatic coolieism, which shall survive. It posits this social Darwinian competition between Americans and Chinese. And that national difference is both gendered in that Americans are men, whereas the Asians are coolies, right? They don't have a sense of individualization. They're just this mass of laborers. And it's also those distinctions are reinforced by the assumption, by the association with certain types of foods, right? Americans, men especially, eat meat, which costs more, and therefore they are more deserving of higher wages, whereas Asians eat rice, something that's inexpensive, something that can sustain mass numbers of laborers, but not allow them some sort of humanity or an individuality. These themes, and I don't know if you can actually see this because of the way the Zoom screen, are repeated over and over again. Here you see an ad for rat poison, and it conflates these rodents, which are undesirable, which are seen as filthy, as unhygienic, with a Chinese man who is seen as eating a rat. So his consumption habits are both despicable, but he himself somehow becomes the embodiment of a rodent that also deserves to be eliminated. And here's another example of a political cartoon that plays on these themes of inappropriate consumption habits and the danger that it brings to the larger body politic. So at the top, you see Uncle Sam being consumed by an Irish caricature on the left and a Chinese caricature on the right. Both these groups were despised immigrants in the mid-19th century. You see them struggling with each other to take over Uncle Sam, to take over the country. In the end, what happens is that the Chinese not only helps to consume Uncle Sam, but the Chinese also consumes the Irish. I'm going to go on to thinking about the next theme, which is about Chinese contagion. That's, I think, another main theme to what's being discussed and circulated right now politically. The idea that it's not only just what Chinese people eat, but that they themselves embody something that's inherently dangerous, that is a public health threat to Americans. One of the key sites of criticism that white Americans had against Chinese workers in the late 19th century was their occupation in Chinese laundries. And I think this is so fascinating because Chinese laundries are not located just in Chinatown. They're located wherever Americans need their services. And so there's a possibility of intimacy of contact. And actually, a number of Asian immigrants, including especially Asian immigrant men, were going into these service type of occupations. They were doing laundry, they were cooking, they were working as houseboys. They had intimate day-to-day contact with white Americans. And here you see a political cartoon of a Chinese laundry worker supposedly spitting on the clothes in order to launder them. Right? Again, this sits that Chinese are the source of contagion, that they are unhygienic, the fear that there's that intimacy of contact, and so whatever happens in these laundries and these businesses will then spread into white American homes. What's interesting, I think, about this attack about Chinese laundries was that it actually resulted in a historic Supreme Court case. Yik Wu took a case of these different restrictions that were put into place to try to bar Chinese laundries from operating. And his court case eventually resulted in the ruling that the Supreme Court passed in 1886, which is say that you can write a law that on the face seems racially neutral, but applied in a particular way that racially discriminates, and that is also a violation of the Supreme Court. I'm sorry, it's a violation of the Constitution. I want to point out that this sense of contagion is embodied, right? That it's embodied in Chinese people, but it also spreads to a sense of the space in which they occupy. So Chinese laundries, Chinatown. Here's another depiction of the fear of bubonic plague and its association with spaces like Chinese American communities. Now, I think we're all learning that viruses do not stop at borders, whether they're neighborhood borders or national borders. But one way in which people were trying to contain their fears and target those fears was to racialize individuals, bodies, and communities. I'm going to just move on to my last slide, which is a way to kind of think about why this is happening. I think if anybody who listens to Trump is aware how much he is concerned about global economic competition. And certainly China is a rising global economic power. So even before the pandemic, the economic trade wars that are being threatened, and certainly not just China, but you think about the antagonism the United States has towards North Korea, and so on and so forth. And that's in this context in which the yellow peril representation of Asian Americans resurfaces. It's something that never quite went away, but it's a language, it's a mentality, it's a cultural deep set of worldviews that are embedded in the American psyche, and that those understandings of the Chinese as not human, as contagious, as threatening, as predatory, are very easily evoked in a time of panic and anxiety. So how do we respond? I'm looking forward to the presentations of our other speakers, and I'm also looking forward to what you come up with in your breakout sessions. I think for me, we need to understand what's happening, and I think this is where Asian American Studies is so important, right? We need lenses of analyses. We need ways of interpreting what's happening so that it's not just a contemporary phenomenon, but something that goes back several centuries deep into this history. I think we need to speak back, and I think we need to do it collectively. So I really want to thank the organizers for creating this type of forum. We are physically distant, but that doesn't stop us from politically mobilizing together. And I think it's important, especially now, that people who are out and about are white nationalists. They're wearing swastikas when they go shopping, KKK hoods. They're using militarized weapons to stake their claim on political rights. And so we need to come together and find ways to create a more positive message about how we can survive and how we can live together. Thank you.
We're going to move on now to hear from Professor Russell Jeung.
Okay, thanks, Kevin, and thank you for that presentation. My presentation tonight will dovetail well with Professor Wu's presentation because history is repeating itself. Just as malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were used to exclude Chinese and to drive out Chinese competition for white workers. Today, we're seeing a tanking economy, we're seeing a pandemic, and we're seeing policies enacted already against us. Trump just instituted the immigration ban, so you could see history repeating itself. The resurrection of the yellow peril. And so throughout history, diseases from Asia have been used to exclude Chinese, to quarantine Asians, to detain and deport Asians from Angel Island, and to justify violence and institute policies. And so we're seeing that today. And knowing that, having been an Asian American Studies faculty member, I knew when I heard about the coronavirus that once it came to the States that Asians in America would be targeted too. And we recognized we needed to document the cases of harassment and racism in order to hold government accountable for our public safety and to hold them accountable for our public health even. And because history repeats itself, we knew it was going to happen. And history repeats itself in that Asians have always resisted the discrimination and racism we faced. After the exclusion, Chinese America engaged in the largest case of mass civil disobedience, and one of the largest cases in American history. Over 100,000 Chinese in America refused to register like they were supposed to. There was a mass boycott against American goods, and thousands of court appeal cases were filed against the Exclusion Act. Today, we're gonna see the same resistance rising up. The Asian American community is mobilizing, and so I wanna share how history is repeating itself, not in that we're victims of discrimination, but how we're standing up against it. So as I said, we created a reporting center knowing that this racism was gonna hit, and immediately we got a flood of responses. We've got over 100 a day coming in, and it wasn't just educated Asian Americans necessarily who are online, but we got reports from elderly people. From over 10% are from non-English speaking populations of our community. And so we're getting a sense of how pervasive and widespread the hate towards Asian Americans is. And so I just want to share the stuff that I read on a daily basis for you to see how harrowing it is and how hate-filled it is. So I'm going to invite Clara and Anki to read these, and I just want you to sit with this. You know, just like Judy said, she's angry. I think it's good for us to be angry and lament right now, because collectively, then we could respond. So Clara, can you read these?
I am posting this on behalf of my dad, a 71-year-old Korean adoptee. Yesterday, he was chased out of a rural convenience store after asking to use the restroom.
I was sitting on the NJ Transit in an inside seat near the window. A man looked at me, went out of his way to lean inside, and coughed on me. He made eye contact with me and walked away.
My niece was at a store today, and this lady spat on an Asian family after insulting them because coronavirus was their fault. It's unbelievable where we are.
We were having a community circle in our grade 4 classroom. One of the students said, "Kill the Chinese" in Spanish when it was his turn to speak. Many of the Spanish-speaking children laughed.
This is very, very bizarre, but ex-husband threatened me that if I do not sign an agreement to follow a corona guideline, he will not return my child to me, even though I have a sole custody. Also, he screamed in front of my child saying, "I do not want to be around you. You are bringing corona to me and this community." I was stunned.
The person said online, "USA should blow out the China." He also commented, "I feel like Trump should use nuclear to finish China."
A white male customer in the drive-thru asked my ethnicity and assumed I had a coronavirus. I asked if there was a problem, and he replied defensively, "The virus came from China." As I got his drink for my partner, he shouted, "Don't touch the top." After I gave his credit card back, he wiped his hands and cards in disgust as if he had a disease.
Overheard in a public restroom. Thank God no Chinese children were at soccer practice to infect others.
We own and operate a Japanese restaurant. On March 26, 2020, 4 glass window panels were vandalized and shattered. We boarded the windows only to be a victim of graffiti the next day. On both days of the incident, I visually inspected the other businesses on the block. Our restaurant was singled out.
My kids were at the park with their dad, who was white. An older white man pushed my 7-year-old daughter off of her bike and yelled at my husband to take your hybrid kids home because they're making everyone sick.
I got pushed and slammed on the floor by a neighbor who lost his job. He yelled at me, "I lost my job because Asians." I got my back, neck, and hand hurt.
I wore a face mask on BART to work. They're about teenagers saying I have coronavirus and use their backpack to hit me.
Thank you. So again, this is these are just a couple of the incidents of now over 1,800 collected since mid-March. And the cases are harrowing and depressing to read. So you could see here, 70 to 80% of the cases are verbal and shunning, but they're not mere microaggression. They're actually often people yelling in Asian Americans' faces with children and elderly present. They're often accompanied with racial slurs and epithets. So a lot of Asian Americans report, they were frozen, they were scared, and they were angry to be victimized in those ways. Another 9% are civil rights violations. Workplace discrimination, being barred from establishments, being barred from ride shares, and clearly our civil rights are being violated. This harassment and the shunning, everybody should have public accommodation, that is safe access to goods and services. But now we're not getting that because we're getting harassed so often. And another 15% are physical assaults and being coughed upon. Those actually rise to the level of being hate crimes where people could be arrested and they're racially motivated. The most egregious case was in a family in Texas. They're a refugee family from Burma. They were slashed and stabbed by an assailant who thought they were Chinese and said, purportedly, it's because of you the coronavirus happens. And so this is being investigated by the FBI as a hate crime. So these are the types of incidents we're getting, but they're just a tip of the iceberg. We know that 80 to 90% of Asian Americans now fear racial bias if they go outside. We know that we have over 45 states reporting these types of incidents, and we didn't even publicize our website. And yet, again, elderly people, limited English speaking people are reporting. So we think it's this is actually a good snapshot of what's going on right now. So I'll skip this. So what are Asian Americans doing about it? What I see is the Asian American community really rising at this moment. And despite the political rhetoric and a lot of the media representations that picture the virus as being a Chinese person with a face mask and showing Chinese people with face masks as having the virus, people are making that connection and that association so that they have a implicit bias that anybody Chinese or looks as a virus. And when they think of the virus, they think of Chinese people. What we're doing is countering this political rhetoric and countering these media representations with our own narratives, with our own statements. So a lot of our elected officials, both on the national and state level in California, have denounced anti-Asian hate, and they're calling on our governments to be more proactive. The group I'm working with, Stop API Hate, we're working with the governor to create a statewide task force to be proactive against racism in various education, Department of Education, law enforcement. So what we're doing is we're needing to flip the rhetoric. US-China relations is the major presidential campaign issue. Like Judy talked about, the Republican Party is using that as their major issue to scapegoat and to deflect blame. And so what we do is flip the political rhetoric and say, as American citizens, we're holding the American government accountable for how we handle the pandemic. We're not going to blame China. I mean, we could criticize China, but really we want to hold the American government accountable. A lot of Asian Americans have developed media campaigns, hashtag movements, such as hashtag Wash the Hate. A lot of celebrities and athletes have stood up against the hate. And so that's been a really good sign. Jeremy Lin is putting up $1 million of his own money to challenge xenophobia and racism. And on the community level, I'm really proud to see Asian Americans on the local level work together. Like Judy recommended that we need to do. China doing rallies to support their businesses. I'm working with the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council and Chinese for Affirmative Action to create this website called Stop AAPI Hate. Again, all this data to document what's going on and then to make strategic policy interventions, depending on whether it's children and youth being harassed or whether it's a particular segment of our workplace. And so actually we could use your help. We need data scientists and data visualization people to help us. We're getting requests from across the country, a lot of local governments wanting to get reports of what's going on and with recommendations. So I could use help on this level, on the policy level. And so if you do see any type of anti-Asian discrimination, we hope you would report it, that you would do your part and to be good bystanders who intervene, or if you experience it yourself, because that adds to the collective voice that Asian Americans have. And we could actually use those types of stories to shift policies and to shift the narrative. To close, the FBI is warning of a potential surge against Asian Americans in terms of hate crimes. So we've already witnessed the surge. We've already documented the surge. And again, it's going to get as we stay longer sheltered in place, as the economy tanks, as they make US-China relations the central campaign theme, and as COVID-19 deaths, people are going to be angrier, they're going to direct it towards Asian Americans. So sorry for this dire prediction, but we need to be vigilant and we need to be organized at this moment. And that's appreciative of this. And I'm appreciative of the groups like CPA, who's like Linda, who's organizing our communities. And I look forward to our discussions and Q&A and how you guys will brainstorm about how we can organize our communities to fight this pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you, Russell. Now we will turn to Linda Lee from CPA.
Hi, everyone. I decided not to do a PowerPoint slideshow, so you just get to see my face for the next 10 minutes or so. Yeah, just to introduce myself again, my name is Linda, and I work with the Chinese Progressive Association. We're based in San Francisco, Chinatown, and I know all the presenters are based in California, but just to acknowledge that maybe not all of our guests here tonight are. And so, yeah, welcome. I'm also the daughter of Hmong refugees. I grew up in Sacramento, in North Sacramento, and I'm the parent to a 2-year-old who is hopefully going to stay outside in the living room. And in my work at CPA and with Seeding Change, I've had the opportunity to work with immigrants, parents, youth, and young Asian American students and activists who are working towards change. And they do this by through leadership development, through community education, by speaking to politicians, holding our electeds accountable. And this is work that we're going to have to be continuing to do in this moment, right? I really appreciate tonight just being with you all in the Stanford community. Stanford is where I learned how to organize, how to understand my Asian American identity and what it means to build power in our communities. And I graduated from Stanford in 2007, right as we're entering in the last economic recession. I don't know how many students are on the call tonight, but I know that for folks who are getting ready to graduate, or you may be experiencing transitions in your life, that this moment brings another level of anxiety and fear. And for all of us, right, like we know right now the ground is shifting beneath us. A lot of things are changing rapidly. We're in this like constant news cycle of daily outbreak rates, number of deaths, what are the unemployment rates today, tomorrow, who's reopening, who's not. That can be incredibly overwhelming. And so I just want to acknowledge the amount of anxiety and the trauma that all of us are living through, and just share a bit with you about what are we seeing on the ground at CPA in Chinatown. So at the Chinese Progressive Association, we work with immigrant and youth, parents, workers, tenants, folks who are living in the SROs, the single room occupancy buildings in Chinatown that house many of our poorest and most vulnerable community members. We have, since the 1970s, have been organizing and working to develop the leadership of folks in Chinatown to change their own community, and to create the changes that we need to make our living conditions better. And we serve the Chinese immigrant community outside of Chinatown as well throughout San Francisco. You know, for many of our members at CPA, they have been worried about the coronavirus since January. I don't know what it was like for you all, but for me, I remember my Facebook thread being like, coronavirus, it's not as bad as the flu, let's not get so angry about it. But really, for a lot of our members who have family in China and Hong Kong, especially our members living in the SROs, folks were worried about what would happen if there was an outbreak here in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, in the US, especially for our families living in SROs who have no options for quarantine or self-isolation. What would their options be if they got sick? And I'm sure all of you are aware of that, you know, before the pandemic and now, and increasingly so, San Francisco, the Bay Area, had some of the greatest wealth disparities in the country. And now with like the record number of unemployment rates, we're still seeing that unfold, the economic crisis that we're experiencing. But we know, what we do know is that our members, folks who work in low-wage jobs in the restaurant industry, that is experiencing an incredible crisis at this moment, are going to bear the brunt of this crisis from at the intersection of the health crisis to the economic crisis, and the rising anti-Asian racism, the targeting of China, and what that means for them and their families, right? We know that folks in the Latinx, Black, Native American, Pacific Islander communities and other Asian immigrant refugee communities are going to be hardest hit. And it is important for all of us. In our work at CPA, we work with other communities of color, other Asian immigrant communities. It's important for us to understand how this pandemic is impacting folks in other communities, so we understand and develop strategies that stand in solidarity also with those communities. A few things that I want to lift up tonight about what we're seeing on the ground is, I think Russell and Judy talked a lot about the historical and systemic implications for the racism that we're seeing, as well as the narrative that is being crafted in this moment. From the individual harassment that people are experiencing. One of our members who is a domestic worker, who lives in San Francisco, who's still working, taking Caltrain to the Silicon Valley, being yelled at for being Chinese, for bringing the coronavirus, not having a choice about whether, how she gets to, how she's able to respond or take care of herself in this moment, right? For some of us, we're able to stay home to avoid the racism, to avoid the pandemic, to avoid the health crisis, but many people are not able to do that, especially working class folks. And I just want to speak a little bit also to the narrative shift that we're seeing, right? The effort by the president to scapegoat Asians and Chinese folks in particular, to blame them for the crisis, and really treating Black, Latino folks, disabled folks, elderly folks as disposable. We're seeing that happen. The effort to disregard and choose which lives matter in this time, right? And who matters most. What we're also seeing in Chinatown with our families living in the SROs, these are 10 by 10 rooms, shared bathroom and kitchen facilities. I know Stanford and other universities sent folks home because of the fear of the pandemic impacting folks living in congregate housing. And, if you could imagine, the people in Chinatown don't have this choice to leave. And what we've been doing in San Francisco Chinatown working with partners such as the Chinatown Community Development Center, working to provide folks access to food so that they could minimize use of shared kitchen space, passing out, distributing PPE equipment, whatever we can get our hands on, from masks to hand sanitizers to gloves, so that people are able to take care of themselves physically. But we also know that this impacts their mental health as well, living in incredibly tight health living conditions with children, with grandparents, while their kids are struggling to take classes on Zoom. People are trying to figure that out. But this is taking a toll on people's physical and mental health. And one thing that we haven't been talking about also is the rate of the impact on Asian Americans in terms of dying from COVID, right? So like, I just, even I didn't know this. We were just remarking at CPA about how we're not talking about this enough, but Asian Americans right now make up 12% of cases of COVID in San Francisco, but nearly 50% of deaths. And while the number is low at 35, that's still significant. Also, what are the implications of racism towards whether or not people are seeking help, going to the hospitals? We're already seeing that impact. And so paying attention, it's important for us to pay attention to the ways that racism is impacting whether or not people feel comfortable to access the healthcare that they need, especially in this moment. I want to share a little bit too about the economic crisis that we're experiencing. A few weeks into the shelter in place, CPA launched a program to support Chinese immigrant folks in the Bay Area to access unemployment insurance by applying to EDD. And if you haven't applied to EDD, you might not know that in order for monolingual speakers of other languages other than English, you have to call a hotline, and EDD hotlines are hard to access. So we've been training up folks, volunteers to support workers who are calling us to apply for unemployment insurance. Hundreds of people have been calling us, leaving messages. Our folks are working around the clock to support as many people as we can. We're training up community organizations to be able to do this work as well, to expand the pool of people to be able to do that. And then the other part of our work is that already we were supporting workers fighting against wage theft when they've been exploited in the job, not being paid the minimum wage, or not being given their rest breaks. And we're definitely paying attention to the impact of workers, especially low wage workers, as they are coming back. As we are trying to reopen the economy, right? What jobs are they going to be coming back to? Are they going to be able to access good and safe jobs? We're hearing reports of employers telling workers that they have to come back to work, otherwise they're going to report them to EDD for exploiting unemployment because they could have accessed a job, right? And that is incredibly problematic and harmful to the folks that we're working with, right? They may not have healthy and safe jobs to go back to. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. I want to just share a few things about, what we're doing, what's on the other side of this crisis. And, for us, like we've been talking about, like, what does it look like, right? Are we going to go back to normal? And we know that that's not possible, but what is this new norm that we're going to be fighting for, that we are fighting for now? We know that what we had before was barely enough for our communities to survive, let alone thrive. And we have to fight for a world where all of us are treated with dignity and respect. And for many of us, like all of our experiences might be different because of class, because of our access to education, our Asian American identities. We all are going to experience different things from this pandemic. And it's important to understand that. What does safety look like coming out of this? How are we creating a world where we're all going to be looking out for one another, and how do we do that, right? how do we acknowledge the different, acknowledge and hold space for each other as we experience racism and harassment, but also hold our electeds and public figures accountable. What does it look like for Asian Americans right now to be building power and fighting for democracy and making sure that our voices are represented at the table so that we can hold them accountable for the racism that we're experiencing, as well as access to good jobs, access to healthcare, access to the equipment that we all need in order for all of our communities to be safe at this time, especially folks who are the most vulnerable, who are going to bear the brunt of this crisis.
Thank you, Linda. So we're going to transition now to a few questions for myself, but before I ask a few questions, I just want to open up questions from the audience and let folks know that if you do have questions, what you should do is to ask the questions in the chat. And if you have a particular panelist who you'd like to direct a question towards, make sure you note that. And Clara and Kevin will curate those questions and ask a few of them after I'm done asking my questions. So I wanted to start off, Judy, following up. I thought you did a really good job of contextualizing this anti-Asian racism within a larger structure of white supremacy and a history of kind of like exclusion. I was wondering if you could do a bit though to connect that to the broader structures of racism that we've seen kind of laid bare under the Trump administration, because it seems like, to me at least, when we look at this rise in anti-Asian violence, when we look at the president's use of Chinese virus as opposed to coronavirus, that this is only part of a larger strategy, whether it be the incarceration of youth at the border, mass incarcerations of Black and Latinx folks in the cities. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more in terms of the history of this, connecting some of these, if there's a way in which we can connect the history of Chinese exclusion to some of these other, to the history of violence against other communities of color as well.
Thanks so much, Will. And that's a wonderful question and great insight. I think they're absolutely connected. When Trump was elected, I mean, his base is white nationalists. It's pretty clear in the way that he reacted to Charlottesville, the way he characterizes African countries, the way he treats young children who are crossing the borders and incarcerating them. It's very clear that he represents a sector in the United States that sees itself as entitled. And I think about that with the protesters who are going to state capitals or walking into subway with these militarized weapons, right? They feel completely entitled to this country, to its resources, to political power. And that stems long term back to the founding of the nation, and thinking about just the very act of creating a nation on somebody else's land, or importing people to work as slaves so they could develop the wealth, or importing workers to come in and to really view their primary contribution as labor and nothing else, not in terms of their humanity, not in terms of political rights. And so if you think about the changing demographics of this country, the folks who are in power are trying to reverse that demographic trend. They're trying to cut off the possibility of new people coming in and becoming empowered. So I think what's happening during the coronavirus, again, is building on existing divisions. And I love what Linda was saying about how some lives matter. The strategy right now, I think of as capitalist eugenics. Like, we need to save the economy. Who cares about lives, right? Some people are going to die, so what? I think that has been the attitude long-standing in this country, and it's just made more apparent right now.
Thank you. Russell, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I know you mentioned this in passing about how folks, other folks out there in the audience might be able to help you with expertise in terms of like visualizing some of the data that you have. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about, I mean, obviously, we're here at a panel at Stanford University We have amongst our, probably at this panel, a wealth of highly educated people who are coming out of one of the top universities in the world. What are some ways that folks can kind of use their privileges as students at Stanford and their training as Stanford, students and alumni? What are some other ways that they can use this position of privilege to help either your organization or perhaps others?
Oh, sorry, my computer just froze. That's a good question. How can we individually work together to organize? For me, I'm more interested in working at the policy level, and that's why I'm trying to develop policy solutions to address the racism at various sites, schools, public streets, corporations. I think everybody has an institutional space where we actually need to denounce hate. I really blame leadership from the top for creating a rhetoric of hate and divisiveness, and that just gives people license to discriminate and to perpetrate acts of racism. So if you're in any institution, I think you gotta demand from your leadership, or if you are the leader, to come out with pronouncements calling for civility, calling for tolerance, calling for respect during this pandemic. So I think actually words matter, and that type of statement actually has a lot of effect. You should hold Stanford University president accountable and have him come out with a statement against anti-Asian racism to make sure that all students in Stanford feel safe and comfortable, right? So whatever institutional space, I think you got to make that culture of your organization, of your faith-based temple, of your union, to come out with statements denouncing hate. It's sad, but we need reminders to treat each other with dignity and respect. And I think that's important. So that's using your political power or whatever social capital you have. I think you could join Asian American organizations that are already working. There's a lot of hashtag movements. There's professional organizations like the Asian American Psychological Association, Asian American Bar Association. There's a lot of professional groups that I think are rallying and using their expertise. Again, I need data scientists, and I've gotten a lot of support because what we need to do is map where hate crimes are occurring. We need to come up with reports that document what's going on. We need to do deep dives into the analyses to see, were police present? Did police actually report on the crime? Did they arrest anybody, right? We need a team of volunteers just to document what's going on, and then we need journalists and media people to tell the story. So I think whatever capacity you're in, whatever institution you're in, you got to hold the institution accountable to make sure that has a culture of safety and tolerance. And then whatever skills you bring to bear, you think about what capacity do I have and how much time do I have to give. And then you could contact a lot of groups that are working on this. So what we need to do is mobilize our social networks.
Thank you. And then Linda, wondering if you could say a little bit more. I know you mentioned in passing kind of working with other communities of color on the ground with CPA. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your thoughts on, as we're kind of denouncing anti-Asian, these anti-Asian hate crimes, anti-Asian incidents of violence, how do we do this in a way that we make sure that we're not calling for things like excessive police presence or mass incarceration, other strategies which have been used to oppress many communities of color?
Yeah, I think one thing to remember is that this is not a race for who is experiencing the worst kind of racism, right? That a lot of our communities are hurting and are under attack and are under constant attack. I think one thing that I know many Asian Americans have been grappling with is like, where do we sit in the United States as a community? We talk a lot, or some of us maybe not everyone, talk a lot about the model minority myth and the ways in which Asian Americans are used to hurt other communities of color, particularly Black folks, right? Used as wedges to legitimize the harm to other communities of color. I think in the early days of the pandemic, and earlier this year, one thing that we were dealing with in San Francisco was an incident where a Chinese immigrant recycler, an elder, was physically assaulted in the Southeast in San Francisco, where a lot of our members live. And in the process of that unfolding, seeing a lot of people call for, basically call for vigilantism, calling for harming other people. And then this, like seeing this message being championed in a lot of ways. And actually for him, he was like, no, I don't, I just want an apology. And for us to hear that message, and for people to hear that message from this elder immigrant person who many people just assume that's not possible, that's not possible, but it is. And what we've been working with some of our Black allies in San Francisco is, and also Chinatown allies, is how do we redefine community safety and justice? What are alternatives to our criminal justice system that we know is overwhelmingly incarcerates Black folks and poor people? What are the alternatives that we have? And how can we create new tools for having a different kind of conversation and accountability process? And it's a lot of work. It's not easy work. There's a lot of new skills that we all have to develop, but the very core of it is what is our response when we get attacked? And are we responding, as Asian Americans right now, when I get attacked, how do I respond? When I hear about another person getting attacked, maybe a Black person, how do I respond? And just creating space for us to really sort through the complex feelings that many of us might feel. And some people may feel where are people, our other communities of color showing up in solidarity to Asian Americans right now? I think that's a question that has come up a lot amongst my folks that I work with. But solidarity is a very complicated issue. And it's something that we have to work together, learn about each other's communities, learn about the ways in which our communities have been have harmed each other, but also how systemic and institutional oppression have hurt our communities historically and currently. And the call to for more policing, these are not the answers that are going to serve us in the long term.
Thank you. I think we'll transition now to have some questions from the audience. So Clara and Kevin, I think, have some questions ready.
Yes, so this was a question that was submitted. And anyone can answer this, but maybe everyone could give a short answer to this. How have you been handling the negative feelings or emotions while working with often depressing or violent information and news? Maybe Russell could start.
I'm currently driven by anger, like Professor Judy talked about, and it's anger for the lack of justice and the racism that not only Asian Americans are experiencing, but all communities of color are facing right now. And but that anger will only sustain you for so long, and it'll eat you up on the inside. And so I cope by drawing on the strength of others, recalling the legacy of our ancestors, holding on to my own faith, and trying to transform that anger to lament, which I think is a cry for justice. And then hopefully, like Linda was just talking about, shifting from anger and lament to empathy and love. And so it's a long process, but it's also what we can be doing in the pandemic, that we come out of the pandemic with a new normal, not only wanting to transform society, but also transforming ourselves inwardly. So I think of this shelter in place time as a time to do both work on myself and to work on society as a whole. But I admit it's difficult.
I can't see Linda, so I can't tell if she's about to speak. I'll just say a few things. I think working with students and working with community organizations have been really helpful for me. I'm not teaching formally this quarter, but I've been working with a group of students to help document Asian American Pacific Islander history in Santa Ana. It's a local city that just celebrated its 150th anniversary, but with very little acknowledgement of AAPI history. Our students started last quarter before the shelter-in-place orders, and they were visiting archives and finding all sorts of really interesting discoveries. And they were looking forward to doing oral histories this quarter, which they're not able to do in person. But we just received approval to move forward with IRB. And so they're going to be interviewing community-based leaders and also community entrepreneurs to try to help document the knowledge that they have, and also to document the experiences of the API community more broadly, especially for the elders in the community who might have heightened issues and are likely to have heightened issues of information access and health access. I know in talking to the students that they are experiencing a lot of anxiety. I think many of us share that, and perhaps the students on the call also share that. Uncertainty about their future, a sense of sadness, especially for people who are graduating this quarter, that maybe they've lost something important in their lives. But I'm really heartened by them because this is a volunteer project, and they find meaning in doing this type of research and meaning to help to bring voice to what people in the community are experiencing. And so I find a lot of strength from that process.
I think what I would add is that right now it's really important to connect with other people. That like whatever you're experiencing, not doing that in isolation, whether it's like looking for the answers. But a lot of my work at CPA is actually to support our staff team. We're about 25 staff, and really like paying attention to like the mental health of our staff right now, especially as folks are having conversations after conversations with workers who are losing their jobs and who are afraid for how they're gonna take care of their family and the vicarious trauma that they're experiencing, and really acknowledging that that's real. We have folks who are going out every day to do food distribution. And for me, that's like incredibly powerful to see that happening, and to like take some time to pay attention and appreciate those folks who are able to go out and who are willing to go out to do that, and to share those stories, and just really like be in connection with other people, checking in with family, with friends. And also like right now that it's also really important to maybe just get a little bit more vulnerable. Like some of us might be experiencing the threat of loss, losing our jobs. Whether you're a low-wage worker or you're working in tech, you know, like so many people are losing their jobs right now. And it can be something that we might feel ashamed of. But it's really important to be connecting with people and sharing with them what's scary right now, and creating new practices that will help us really come out of this stronger, as Russell said.
Another question that an audience member shared via email was that they experienced an online remark, "Go back to your country," meaning not America, in a group chat. And they're wondering what is the best way of dealing with people who make these types of remarks. Another audience member asked, how do we go about addressing microaggressions? Or we might witness this happening to others. So maybe a bit of a practical question, but how do we respond, whether in an online or a real world setting, to this type of situation?
I could address the real life situation. And actually this is, again, these types of incidents are pervasive. So I think we will come across incidents of harassment or microaggression. And a lot of times they happen really quickly. And so people don't have a chance to intervene. But if you do have the opportunity to intervene, we recommend that you not engage with the perpetrator, but you attend to the targeted person. Because by trying to engage with the perpetrator, it just gives them more voice. It gives them a platform, and they want to express themselves. But by attending to the targeted person, that gives them a chance to get to a safe place. That gives them an opportunity to express what's happening to another person. And it shows that there are allies around. So that's my sort of general recommendation. I tend to think when people are being harassing or racist or prejudicial, they're not really operating out of executive function. And so it's really hard to engage and debate or to educate people. So I just think, but you do want to express yourself, and you do want to wish you don't want to be victimized and be silenced. And that's why I encourage reporting to reporting centers, like Linda talked about, sharing with your friends, finding social support. And that's why if you're a bystander, check in with that person to let them vent and to share their experience.
So is that it for our chat questions? Shall we begin to transition to breakout rooms? Yeah, okay. All right, so thank you panelists for sharing all of your thoughts and your remarks. So what we're gonna be doing now is we're gonna move from the panelist section of the event to small breakout rooms where folks can talk about the topic for tonight. We have a few community norms which we've developed just to help facilitate discussion in these small rooms. Community norms: communicate with respect, listen to what others are saying while speaking your own mind. It's okay that there are differences of opinion. Make sure you let one person speak at a time. So, people should be respectful of others. Mute your mic when others are speaking. Brave space, safe space. In other words, we hope that you can work past any reluctance or discomfort and step up to share your thoughts. This should be a safe space for folks. Acknowledge others' experiences. When someone shares something that has happened to them, don't minimize or downplay their emotions or their lived experience. It's okay to acknowledge that your words have hurt someone else, or to give feedback that what someone has said was hurtful to you. Use I statements. Statements such as "I feel when" are less aggressive than you statements that make judgments about others' intentions. You are. And then Vegas rule: whatever is said stays in the room, but take what you learned with you. If you witness a difficult situation, you can remind the group or the person speaking of the group norms. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this event. The resources that our speakers shared, and as well as upcoming events sponsored by SAPAC, will be included in a follow-up email we'll send to everyone. So we'll make sure that we curate all of the resources that have been mentioned and send it all to you so you can have it in one place. I'd like to also thank once more all the co-sponsors for this event tonight: Asian American Activity Center at Stanford, Asian American Students Association, Asian American Studies, Okada House, and of course Stanford Asian Pacific American Alumni Club. It's been a pleasure moderating this event this evening, and thanks so much. I hope to see many of you again at other events in the future. And that is it. Good night, everyone.